Well, Christmas, the day is behind us. We're still in the Christmas season, but the actual day has moved to the past, which means we're kind of in a new season. And the study group in the fall, we were studying this book, What Christianity Is Not by Doug John Hall. They suggested that I do a sermon series on the book when the opportunity provided. And it just so happens that between Christmas and Lent, there's the same number of weeks as there is chapters in the book. So that's going to fill the gap between Christmas and Lent. But also, I think it really follows up Advent and is still in the vein of the Christmas season. So Advent is about change. It's about waiting for the Messiah who is going to bring change and justice, etc. And Christmas is about the surprise of that change. The answer to the question we were asking was very unexpected and perhaps even not the one we wanted. It's the one we needed, but it's not the one we wanted. We expected a powerful person, perhaps a politician, military leader, important public figure. And what we got was someone preaching change without power from an accessible working class place. He was just out in the neighborhoods. He was an everyday guy. Came to us as a baby the same way we all come into the world, grew up the same way we all do, etc. So the change is unexpected, but also it's very accessible. And God is very accessible. I want to use expansive language for God. You'll understand why in a minute. But the idea of God it's God's too big to fit into our heads. We can't comprehend God, which raises some challenges. Yet Jesus came and walked among us and spoke with us in our language, which then would have been Aramaic. And we've still got the stories of it. We don't walk on the street with Jesus anymore, but we've got the continued stories and tradition from that time. And, the Holy Spirit continues to illuminate our path and God continues to guide and etc. The point is God is accessible. Now, if we're the intentional community surrounding this idea that God's accessible and that the answer to justice that we're looking for is unexpected, what should we be looking like? We've got 2,000 years of history, and it's a wide history, a complicated history, and there's positives and negatives in that history. So it's not a foregone conclusion that we should look like we do now. So the question that I think is really important right now, especially during the pandemic, because we're not going to look the same once the vaccine rolls out, is what should we look like? And we've got a month to think about that. So, What Christianity Is Not is a bit of a cheeky title, and I wouldn't be surprised if Doug Hall was maybe, being a little pushy or prickly, because, he makes his own position very clear in the book, and I don't think he's afraid of a conflict. But it's kind of an important title, What Christianity Is Not, and the subtitle is An Exercise in Negative Theology. And he sort of keeps coming back to this quote from Augustine, Si comprehendis, non est Deus. If you understand it, then it's not God. And the idea is that we can't really say what God is because God is bigger than we can comprehend. We've certainly got ideas about God, and the church has said a lot about God over the years. But the second we start trying to define God, we put God in a human-shaped box. And that is all of a sudden not God. So the second we think, we understand God, that's not God. And that can be applied to just Christianity in general as an idea. And so what Doug Hall is saying is that we can't say what God is or what Christianity is, because Christianity is sort of the following of God, but we can say what God is not and get into the neighborhood. He actually has this great quote from the introduction. It says, "Western theology knows a lot more about God than it should or could," which I think is really interesting. We've said a lot about God over the years, more than we could really know, which means we're actually pointing at something other than God. He also says that when we start doing that, we become exclusive. So who's to say that what I say about God is if I say this about God and you say that about God, who's right? Hall would say neither of us are right, because you can't say what God is. But my point is, as soon as you start sort of saying definitive things and disagreeing, you're becoming exclusive. If this is the box of Christianity and you don't fit it, then you're out. And that's pretty problematic. And that's something that the church has engaged a lot in over the last millennia, really. I won't get into church history today, but that is an action that the church is engaged in quite a bit. And Hall is saying that, really all we can be saying is what we're not. And all we can be saying about God is what God's not, because si comprehendus non est Deus. If you understand it, it's not God. And we're more inclusive when we do that. Whereas once we start saying things about God, we're pointing at something else and being exclusive about it. So that's kind of what the book's about. It's about saying what we're not so that we can get closer to what we are. I think he's ruffling some feathers with that title. But that's sort of the gist of it, is saying, we can't say who we are, but we can say what we're not. Now, the other thing that's really important to remember about Doug Hall is he's sort of one of the loudest voices, if not one of the front runners, in talking about the end of Christendom. And Christendom was the era where the church was ubiquitous. In Canada, at the peak of church attendance, according to the Canadian census, 60% of people had been to church in the last month, I think is the question. And of that 40% remaining, a good chunk of them would have at least identified as Christian and known clearly what happens in church and known what church is about. That's Christendom. That era where the minister can walk into the mayor's office and say, "Hey, I don't like what's going on," or into when the church had a lot of power and when a lot of people went to church. That's Christendom. And in Canada, that's really only disappeared in the last 50 years. The height of the church, period, according to Canadian statistics, is 1967. That's when we had the most Christians in Canada. And, other nations sort of follow that closely. But we've gone from the church's absolute peak in the 60s to pretty much one of the lowest periods of the church ever today. And we've seen that in, not a long lifetime. If you're 53 years old, you were born at the peak of the church. That's how it is. And today, we've got we're going on third generation unchurched. So, I've got a friend of mine that a good old friend of mine has no idea what happens in church, because she's never been, her parents have never been. She just has to piece it together. And it's kind of fun to get together and say, "Okay, what do you think we do on Sunday?" And she really has no idea. But anyway, that's what Hall's talking about. He's saying that we're not in this position that we used to be, where we had a lot of power and a lot of strength and resources and acceptance and things like that. We're in this other period where, we used to have those things and we're still known, but we're something else. And Hall was really one of the first ones to talk about it. I think the really interesting thing about Hall is that he clearly doesn't speak negatively about that time. He talks about negative things the church has done and things like that, but he's into his 90s, and he enjoyed that period. And you talk to folks his age, especially like clergy and things, that were doing ministry in that era, and like they had the resources to do things, and they had the power and the acceptance, and they were doing really exciting things. It was probably a lot of fun, and that's gone. And what I find that's different about a lot of people, Hall clearly appreciated that, but I think he's mourned it. He said, I love that era, but it's gone, and we're doing this now. And I think that's where a lot of us fall down, even ministers my age that never knew anything resembling Christendom. I think a lot of us are still sort of going, hey, wouldn't it be great to be a minister in those times? We're really, as a larger community, mourning, or we haven't finished mourning the end of that. A lot of us want to go back to that. Hall is saying, hey, that might have been great, but it's gone. And I think that's the really interesting thing about Hall, and what allows him to write a book like this. So, as we go into this time, I want you to just take some time and think about what the church is to you. This has not been a particularly biblical sermon. It's been a theological sermon. We've talked a lot about God and theology and things like that. Not particularly biblical, but if you're to look at the Isaiah passage attached to the blog, and the message of Christmas, and sort of think about those things, what should we be? What should we look like? Should we look like we do now? Should we be something different? I really encourage you to write that down. You can either do it on a word processor, or I like to write things out by hand when I'm doing contemplative work, because I don't know, there's something special about it. But write it down and then put that document away. If you've put it on a piece of paper, fold it up, maybe put it in an envelope and put it in a drawer. But just write down, what you think the church is and what you think the church should be. And then in 7 weeks, I'm going to ask you to pull that out and just, do the exercise again, and then pull it out and compare, and see if you've moved. See if you've learned anything, or thought about anything new, or had any revelations or things like that. So, what Christianity is not. We can't say what it is. Maybe we can say what it's not. Let's take some time to think about that in the next 7 weeks. Amen.